The night the levee held, my father called Warren Grady a liar to his face, right there in the churchyard, in front of the whole congregation of Miller's Fork. "You've been digging on my line for 2 years, Warren," he said, loud enough that old Mrs. Halloran stopped fanning herself. "Don't stand there and tell me it's for drainage." Warren Grady didn't raise his voice. He never did. He just tipped his hat, said, "Believe what you like, Ezra," and walked to his wagon like a man who had somewhere better to be. I was 11 years old that spring of 1911, and I remember thinking my father was right to be angry, because everybody in the county thought so too. The trench ran the whole length of the property line between our farm and the Grady's, maybe 400 yards, cut deep and straight through good bottomland that had never needed draining in the 30 years my grandfather worked it. Warren had started it the autumn before, alone, with a mule and a scoop plow, working after his own chores were done, sometimes by lantern light. Nobody in Miller's Fork dug drainage ditches by lantern light. Nobody dug them that deep either, deep enough that my little brother Thomas once dropped a fishing pole into it and couldn't touch bottom reaching for it. My father's theory, and it wasn't a foolish one, was that Warren Grady meant to move the property line. Every farmer along the Cedar Fork knew that a ditch, left long enough, becomes a fence in the eyes of the county surveyor. Water finds its own boundary, and boundaries have a way of becoming law. Ezra Cotter, my father, had inherited 80 acres from his own father, and there wasn't a man alive who could tell him a spadeful of it belonged to anyone else. So when Warren kept digging through that winter, into the spring, past the planting, my father stopped speaking to him altogether. Fences got walked. Surveys got mentioned. The Gradys and the Cotters had shared a well-worn path between our two kitchens since before either of us boys were born. And by June of that year, the path had gone to weeds because nobody walked it anymore. I want to tell you now what my father didn't know and what I didn't understand myself until years later, sorting through a cedar box in my mother's attic. But telling it in order is the only way it makes any sense, so bear with me. That summer was dry until it wasn't. The Cedar Fork ran low enough in July that you could cross it without wetting your knees, and the corn stood pale and stunted, curling at the edges like it was trying to fold itself away from the sun. Everyone said it was shaping up to be the worst year since '93. My father prayed for rain the way farmers pray, which is to say without much hope and a great deal of resentment. Warren Grady kept digging. By August, the trench had reached nearly to the tree line at the eastern edge of both farms, where the land dropped toward a low bowl of scrub oak and sumac that flooded, on the rare occasion it flooded at all, into a wash that fed the Cedar Fork half a mile downstream. My father took to watching Warren work from our porch in the evenings, arms crossed, saying nothing, the way a man watches a neighbor build something he's sure will fall down on somebody's head eventually. "He's got a plan," my father said once to my mother. Not to me, though I was sitting close enough to hear. "Warren Grady doesn't do anything without a plan. I just can't work out whose land he means to flood." My mother, who had grown up 2 farms over from the Gradys and remembered Warren's father, old Silas, better than my father did, only said, "Maybe give him the benefit." My father did not give him the benefit. The rain came on the second Tuesday of September, and it did not stop. I remember the smell of it before I remember the sound. That mineral, metal smell that rolls in ahead of a real storm, different from an ordinary shower, the kind of smell that makes dogs go quiet and cattle bunch up against a fence line. The sky over the Cedar Fork Valley went the color of a day-old bruise by 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 my father was nailing the storm shutters over the kitchen windows while my mother packed a lamp, matches, and the family Bible into an old flour sack, which was the closest thing we had to a plan for a night like that. It rained 4 inches in 3 hours. Then it rained harder. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, over the roar of it on the tin roof, we heard the Cedar Fork go from a rumor to a roar itself. A deep, continuous grinding sound, like something enormous being dragged across gravel, that didn't stop and didn't stop and didn't stop. My father went out onto the porch with a lantern that the wind put out twice before he gave up trying to keep it lit, and he stood there in the dark, listening to a river he couldn't see, rising toward a house he'd built with his own hands. That was the night the Kessler place, a mile downstream, lost its whole east pasture and 2 mules to the water. That was the night the low bridge at Miller's Fork washed out entirely and wasn't rebuilt until the following spring, And that was the night the bowl of scrub oak and sumac at the eastern edge of our two farms, the low ground that never flooded, filled up with water the way a bathtub fills, steady and patient, and then kept rising past where anybody had ever seen it rise. By midnight, the water had backed up out of that bowl and was pushing west, toward our two farms, toward two houses built on ground that had always been high enough. Except the water didn't come for our house. It came for the trench. I didn't understand what I was seeing at the time. I was 11, soaked through, terrified, standing at my mother's elbow at a window with the shutter half open because my father had gone back out into it with a lantern that wouldn't stay lit, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rain. What I understand now, what took me years and a dead man's ledger to understand, is this. Warren Grady's trench caught that floodwater like a gutter catches rain off a roof, and carried it, the whole rising weight of it, away from our two farms and down along the property line, past both our houses, both our barns, both our root cellars, all the way to the old wash that fed the Cedar Fork a half-mile downstream. It didn't save the Grady's land. Warren's own east field, the one that ran closest to the trench, took the worst of it. Silt and standing water 3 feet deep by morning, a fence line torn out root and post, 6 hogs drowned in a low pen he hadn't had time to move. He lost more that night than any other farmer on the fork, because his own land sat lowest along that ditch he'd dug, and the ditch drew the water toward itself the way any drainage works, without prejudice for whose field it was crossing. Our house didn't flood. Not the cellar, not the barn, not the smokehouse. My father walked the line the next morning in a fog so thick you could barely see the fence posts, and he came back to the kitchen and sat down at the table and didn't say anything for a long while. "He built it for us," he finally said. Not a question. My mother didn't answer, and I remember thinking that was strange, because usually she was quick to agree with him about anything having to do with kindness. Warren didn't come around to be thanked. He was out in his ruined east field before the water had even fully receded, pulling drowned hogs out of the mud with a borrowed team, and when my father walked over, the first time he'd crossed that overgrown path between the two kitchens in a year, Warren just nodded at him like they'd spoken yesterday and said, "You'll want to check your seed corn in the loft." Roof might have took some wind. That was all. No explanation. My father tried twice more over the following weeks to get him to talk about the trench, about why he'd spent a year of evenings digging it, about what it had cost him to dig it in a place that guaranteed his own land would flood worst. Warren changed the subject both times. By the time I was grown and had my own family, the two of them had settled into an easy, wordless friendship of the kind old farmers have, built on borrowed tools and shared harvests, and neither of them ever raised the subject of the trench again in my hearing. I found the answer in 1947, the year my mother died, going through the cedar box she kept at the top of her closet. The same flour sack contents from that storm night, oddly enough, still folded inside, along with letters, a lock of my sister's hair, and a small leather ledger I didn't recognize. The ledger had belonged to my grandfather, Ezra Cotter. It wasn't a farm ledger, no seed counts, no grain weights. It was a debt book, the kind men used to keep before banks handled everything, and most of the entries meant nothing to me. But one entry, dated November of 1889, stopped me cold. Silas Grady, paid in full the debt of his life, owed to me since the flood of '81, by his own hand and asking, in the form of $40 I did not want and would not have asked for. Told him plain it was not necessary. He said a debt like that does not go away for the asking. I asked my mother's cousin, old enough to remember, what my grandfather had done in the flood of 1881. She told me what half the county had once known and mostly forgotten, that in that flood, 30 years before the one I'd lived through, my grandfather Amos had pulled Silas Grady, Warren's father, out of the same low bowl of scrub oak and sumac, half drowned and pinned under a fallen elm, at the risk of his own life, and had never once mentioned it afterward, not even to his own son. Warren Grady had grown up hearing that story from his father. He'd have been a boy no older than I was that September night, listening to old Silas tell it. And somewhere in the 2 years before he ever lifted a scoop plow, Warren must have looked at that same low bowl of ground, the one where his father nearly died, the one that sat between his family's farm and ours, and understood something my own father never once considered. That ground remembers where the water wants to go, and a debt like that doesn't go away for the asking either. It just waits for the right storm to come and prove itself. Warren never told my father any of it. I don't think he ever intended to. He dug 2 years of evenings by lantern light to move a flood off ground it had already claimed once before, in payment for something his own father owed and had already tried, and failed, to pay in cash. I still have that ledger. I keep it in the same cedar box, on the same shelf, in a house not far from where the trench used to run. The county filled it in decades ago when they widened the road, and there's nothing left to mark where it was, except a line of ground that still drains a little quicker than the ground around it. Every spring, when the snow melts, and nobody's watching. I never told my father what I found. He'd been gone 11 years by then, and some debts, I've come to think, are meant to stay quiet even after they're finally paid.